It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about his book, The Catholic Gentlemannet, Living Authentic Manhood Today, is the Catholic gentleman, Sam Guzman. Thanks for being here, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. What is a Catholic gentleman?
A Catholic gentleman is a man who is first and foremost Catholic.
Okay.
And the Catholic faith is the center of his life, and serving our Lord Jesus is his calling. But beyond that, he's also a man. And I know that sounds basic, but in our confused culture, it's not so basic anymore. When we're seeking to deny biology, and biological males are now trying to compete on girls' high school sports teams. And we were just at the doctor, and there was we were filling out paperwork. There were about 15 different choices on the paper for what your gender identity was. And things are more confusing than they've ever been. So getting back to the basics, very basics, that biological manhood is a reality. And we need to acknowledge that, and we need to accept that, and we need to live that. Men are different from women. We have natural tendencies that are different, but those need to be channeled and controlled and disciplined by virtue. And that's where the gentleman part comes in. A gentleman is a man who is under control. He is serving and seeking the good. He loves truth, and he wants to give his life for our Lord Jesus in big ways and small ways. And so he lives a life of sacrifice for the good of others, disciplined and controlled by virtue.
And besides the biological issue, just the idea of living a life of a man, like being a man, why is there confusion about what that means, do you think?
Sure, and I think part of it goes back to simply just the breakdown of cultural standards and traditions. I mean, beyond the biological reality, every culture has always had a context in which you became a man. It wasn't confusing. Men walked a certain way, they talked a certain way, they dressed a certain way, they had certain code of conduct that they lived by. And this really was the case for almost all of human history until maybe the 1960s, when things started to break down and there was a radical rejection of that masculine tradition and a kind of free-for-all, sexually and otherwise, where men just took it upon themselves to reinvent everything. And there was all kinds of experimentation going on with rejecting marriage and things, and trying new forms of cohabitation. And so things really started to break down around the late 1960s, and we're never really recovered since. That progression has just continued to the point where today we don't even acknowledge that there is a biological reality there. So I think it goes back to that loss of those cultural attributes of manhood, and I think that's why a lot of men are starting to look back to times past. And some people say, well, it's just misguided nostalgia. Well, maybe it could be, but also I think it's just trying to find your moorings and bearings in a culture that's discarded almost every masculine tradition, and the men are looking for something to hold on to, and sometimes we have to look back to find our way forward.
Do you think toxic masculinity is a problem?
Yes and no. I would say that the word can often be abused in the sense that it's used to describe all masculinity. Any male assertiveness or aggressiveness, or any male desire to lead, or any male desire to take risks is just construed as bad. And I think when the word is used, toxic masculinity is used in that way, it's definitely misguided. Men are, again, different than women, and that's not a bad thing. But second, I do think that men largely have failed to live up to their masculine calling, to reveal the dignity of women to them, and to treat them with honor and respect. And we look at hookup culture or porn culture or things like that, where men have just kind of descended to the lowest common denominator. Now, there's reasons for that. It didn't just happen in a vacuum. There's a great degree of fatherlessness in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
There are not many masculine role models. there isn't a large amount of pressure from our media to hold men to a certain standard. And instead, it's the exact opposite. Our media, our corporate advertising, that kind of thing, always shows men in the lowest common denominator, and men live that out, and that's tragic. We do need to get back to virtuous manhood, but no, masculinity in and of itself is not toxic, but a lot of the way men behave can be in our culture, and so we do need to get back to lives of virtue and integrity and ultimately holiness.
It seems like there's kind of two extremes, maybe, of interpretations of manliness, of masculinity, both of which are dangerous. One completely saying that it doesn't matter and that there is no need to have difference between men and women. The other being this kind of machismo, which is dangerous as well. But are we supposed to be somewhere in the middle?
Yes, absolutely. And our culture always seems to swing to extreme. It's just the pendulum, and it's either a complete effeminacy and weakness, or it's this exaggerated masculinity that's all about just ramming a bull in a china shop, just ramming your way through life, and that's neither one is correct. Gentleman, the reason the word gentleman I think is appealing to so many people is that it represents that middle ground. It represents that strength, but also strength under control. It's refined power. It's power that's directed towards what's good and what's right. And I think what you see oftentimes with the extreme of the extreme machismo and things like that is just power and strength for its own sake. How big can I get my biceps? Well, what are you going to do with that? It doesn't matter. I just want to be as built as I can possibly be. I don't want anyone to hurt me. I want to just get what I want out of life. I want to take everything from everyone. And that is not masculinity. True, men have strength, but we should use that and control that and channel that for the good of others and for the common good. And that takes sacrifice. And that's not a popular word in our culture, but ultimately sacrifice, I believe, is inherent to manhood. And I think that one of the last places we see that is in our military, where we still honor those heroes who, the man who jumps on a grenade, and who saves his comrades or who rescues others. Those attributes are things that we still admire at some, but usually only in the military. Everywhere else, we don't admire them. And we need to get back to that.
We're talking with Sam Guzman, author of The Catholic Gentleman, Living Authentic Manhood Today. And does being a Catholic gentleman look the same for every Catholic man trying to be holy? Or is there kind of different ways that the Catholic gentleman lives the life that he's called to be?
That's a great question. And the answer is no, it doesn't look the same for everyone. It's not just about a three-piece suit and a bow tie or finely polished shoes or anything like that. Those things are fine and good in the proper context. But everyone's context is different, and Jesus lived 2,000 years ago, and he lived in rural Israel. They dressed completely differently than we would dress now, or that someone would dress in the 1500s. And so it does change based on your context. Someone in, rural Wyoming or like rural Oklahoma where I live, with a three-piece suit and shiny shoes would look ridiculous. But if you're in New York City, Manhattan, and you're a stockbroker, maybe that would be completely appropriate. So it does depend on context. But what does matter is that we dress with refinement, with dignity, that we treat others with respect in our conduct, and yes, in our dress, because our way we dress is a form of communication. So whatever your context is, take that into account and represent that respect for others, that dignity, that integrity in the way that you carry yourself, the way you behave, and if necessary, in the way that you dress. And it does vary, but the principles remain the same.
And each chapter of the book kind of hits a different topic. Can you share a couple of the different topics, and do you have a favorite maybe?
Sure. Well, we have everything from how to virtuous drinking to fashion advice from a doctor of the church, St. Francis de Sales,
okay.
To the meaning of marriage, to the significance of our bodies, which is often lost in our culture, and everything in between. There's something for everyone. Whatever your state in life is, I think you'll find something that will be helpful and enjoyable.
Was there one topic that was harder to write than the others, or maybe one that was particularly easy for you to write?
Yeah, so I think the fun chapters like virtuous drinking and that kind of thing were more easy to write. But as far as the more difficult chapters, I think the hardest chapter, believe it or not, was actually the chapter on what is a Catholic gentleman, because it's such a cool sounding phrase and a lot of people are drawn to it, but actually pinning it down, what it means, it was a little more challenging than you'd think. Because we don't want to overemphasize the externals, as we were just talking about. But obviously those are involved. And so just pinning that down was a little more challenging than I expected.
Well, and one of the things that you have, kind of skipping to the end, you have an appendix for Catholic Gentleman's Rule of Life, which I feel like gives some really tangible, kind of concrete examples of what it means to be a man. Do you mind sharing some of those and sharing where they came from?
Sure. So, yeah, I love this idea of, 10 commandments for men, that kind of thing. And I really wanted to write a basic code of life for men, because I do think that that's something that we often miss. So as far as what those look like, I will fear, honor, and love God above all others, even at the cost of my life. I will honor holy things and treat them with respect. I will learn to pray as if my eternal salvation depends on it, because it does. And I will struggle for virtue and to overcome myself, no matter how difficult the process, not sinking to the level of mediocrity and excuse making. And it just goes on. But I think what I was really getting at was that we no longer have a code of honor, a code of conduct that we live by. And again, traditional cultures did, rightly or wrongly. Sometimes those were good, codes. Sometimes they were not. But we need a code to live by, or else we sink to the level of pure pragmatism, where we just do whatever is most convenient in the moment for ourselves. And that's no way to live. And ultimately, it leads to unhappiness. And so I just wanted to give a basic code of conduct for men. Like, hey, how do I order my life? How do I make choices? And here are 10 principles. So you can read the rest of them if you get the book. Yeah.
And is this just for adult men?
No, in fact, I've had a lot of parents asking me, hey, is this appropriate for my teenage son who is just graduating from high school or whatever? So I always say, yes, it is appropriate, and I think it's very accessible. The chapters are short. This is not a big theological treatise by any means. It's practical and applicable to everyone from teenagers all the way up to seniors, I believe. So I definitely recommend it for parents who may be considering it for the teenage son.
Very cool. Where can people get a copy of it?
Well, it's available on Amazon, of course, Barnes & Noble, and, of course, your local Catholic bookstore. Almost every local Catholic bookstore I've checked with has at least a few copies, or at Ignatius.com, which is the publisher, Ignatius.com. So pretty much anywhere books are sold, you can find a copy.
And of course, people can check out CatholicGentlemannet for more resources that you have up there. What else do you have available on your website?
Well, the website is really just an expanded version of the book almost. There's hundreds and hundreds of posts on every topic imaginable, spiritual reflections for different seasons of the year, on how to tie a bow tie, on how to shave, things like practical things like that. We've got a series on what to look for in a future spouse if you're dating, how to go about meeting a good Catholic individual, things like that. So really, again, just something for everyone, and fun stuff, serious stuff, everything in between, Catholic trivia. So just check it out, CatholicGentleman.net.
All right. And again, the book is The Catholic Gentleman, Living Authentic Manhood Today. Thanks so much, Sam Guzman. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you.